Scriptures, Old and New Testament, you'll find numerous biblical characters who had reason to be discouraged. And many of them voiced that discouragement, like Job, and sometimes in the Psalms and other places. But one individual for me stands out as an individual who is able somehow to combat discouragement in his life and able to overcome it again and again. And that one person, for me, was the Apostle Paul. If anybody had reason to be discouraged, it was the Apostle Paul. He faced numerous hostilities and persecution against him for his faith. If you were to turn in the Scriptures to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, start at verse 23 and kind of work your way through, you'll hear him give a brief account of all that's happened to him in his life in ministry. He talks about being shipwrecked, being whipped, being beaten with rods, being stoned, being thrown out of cities, imprisoned, and so forth, again and again and again. And yet he was able to keep going. In fact, some years after he wrote that letter, he wrote to the church at Philippi. And he was writing to them while he was in a Roman prison. And he said to them in Philippians chapter 4, verse 4, he said to them, I say to you, rejoice. I'll say it again, rejoice. He was overcoming it. He was overcoming the discouragement. He said earlier in that same book, chapter 3, verse 14, he said, I press on. In other words, I'm not disabled. I haven't lost my desire. It kept that man going. Something was keeping Paul going and able to overcome the discouragement. Now we try to find alternatives. We try to find quick things and quick solutions. Maybe it's this or some other form or some other substance. And sometimes it's in those broken, meaningless cliches that get tossed around. You've heard a few of them when you're discouraged. Abraham Lincoln told of a time when an ancient monarch gave charge to his wise men to invent a sentence that could be put up and that would always be in front of the people as a source of encouragement. And this is what they came up with. You'll recognize this. This too shall pass. Have you ever heard somebody say that? This too shall pass. I know that's true for kidney stones, not personally, but I know they do pass. But I just don't latch onto that, you know. That just doesn't get me revved up when somebody says, this too shall pass. You know, that really doesn't work for me. Franklin D. Roosevelt, respected leader in our history of our nation, he was the one that came up with the words of encouragement where he said, when you get to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on. Folks, my grip isn't that strong after a while, you know. There's got to be something more than these little meaningless cliches. Winston Churchill, he once said that when you're going through hell, keep going. Well, okay, but which way? Don't always know how to get out of there when you get in there. I need something more. I need something more to keep me going, to keep me encouraged. There's another site called Crosswalk, crosswalk.com. I look at this every once in a while, and their site, a Christian site, crosswalk.com. And they came up with 15 ways to deal with discouragement. I'm not going to tell you all 15 because the first two I really latched on. The first one is pray. Pray. It was the Apostle Paul that said in 1 Thessalonians 5:17, be praying continually. That's a big mistake a lot of people make, because the only time they pray is when they need God, when it's obvious they need God, when they're having a 9/11 experience, then they go to God. That's not going to cut it. We need to be in constant communication and fellowship with our Lord. That's natural. That's normal. You are a spiritual being. You're not just physical. You are a spiritual being, so it is natural for you to be in connection with a spiritual being called God. That's normal. That's natural. It's not normal. It's not natural to be out of connection with God. That's when we're going to falter. That's when we're going to get discouraged, and it's going to become a disabling discouragement, because it is normal and natural, according to our divine Creator, that we be in connection with Him and we be in prayer with Him. The second point that they came up with is, remember who God is. Remember who God is. In other words, get your attention off your circumstances or situation and get it back on God where it belongs. Get it back on God where it belongs. And remember that it is God's nature to help. That is consistent with the very nature and character of God. That when we call to him, God will help. Seek me and you will find me when you seek me with all your heart, God said. Draw near to God and he'll draw near to you, James 4. Those passages remind us that that's natural, that's normal. Now, when the Apostle Paul was writing to the church at Ephesus, he was concerned, from that first verse that Kathy read for us this morning, that they were becoming discouraged, that they were being pulled down. They were becoming discouraged not so much because of their present own personal circumstances, but they were worried about Paul. They were concerned about his well-being. You see, when Paul began his ministry with the Ephesians, it started out rough. It started out bad right from the very beginning. If you look in the 19th chapter of Acts, you'll find the account of when Paul first went to Ephesus, and he began to proclaim to them the good news of Jesus Christ. Now, Ephesus was the center of worship for the false deity Artemis, a deity who was composed of their idol that was a grotesque, multi-breasted fertility god. And that's where everybody went to worship this deity. And all the different trade guilds were involved in this. They would make these little idols and sell them like at tourist traps, But it was different there. They'd sell these idols, and it was a great source of income because everybody came to Ephesus to worship, that divine goddess, Artemis. And so along came Paul and began to proclaim to them the truth of Jesus Christ. And they began to give their hearts and their lives to him. And those who were involved in the economy of Ephesus became very angry. And if you read in Acts chapter 19, there was a great riot. So it started out bad right from the get-go. But these Ephesian Christians also knew of what Paul was going through. They knew of what he was dealing with. In fact, he wrote this letter about AD 63 from Rome while he was already under house arrest. He had already begun his years of imprisonment in Rome that wouldn't last long, and he would never leave Rome alive. Under orders of Emperor Nero, he would be executed for the faith. So there he was, their man who came to them with the gospel of Christ was in prison. And they knew the kind of life he had had to lead. They knew of what he had endured and the sufferings and the persecution that he went through. And they were feeling helpless. There's nothing we can do about it. I'm sure you can identify with that. That often happens when we have something happen in our life and we become discouraged. There's that accompanying feeling of not only hopelessness, but helplessness. I can't do anything about it. I can't fix this. It's bigger than me. It's stronger than me. It's a mountain that I cannot move. And it causes us to feel discouraged. And so Paul said, I'm writing to you because I don't want you to be discouraged, and I want to encourage you. Now, Paul knew how they were feeling. You see, the man who delivered Paul's letter from him to the Ephesians was a man by the name of Tychicus. Tychicus was a native of Ephesus. And he had come to Paul in Rome, and he told him face to face, this is what these people are feeling. This is what they're going through. Paul, they are discouraged. And he knew. And I love the focus of Paul, the Apostle Paul's attention. Oftentimes, when we feel discouraged and people come up to us and they're concerned and they ask about it, we put on this front and we become very stoic, and we try to put up a front, a brave, strong front. Oh, I'm okay. I'm doing all right. And all we're doing is just calling attention to ourselves, and that doesn't glorify God. That doesn't glorify God. That calls our attention to me, to you. Paul wouldn't do that. I'm not going to call attention to me. I'm not going to tell you, feed you a line that, oh, I'm toughing it out. I'm hanging in there. I tied a knot in the end of the rope, and I'm hanging on, Instead, he said, I'm praying to God for you. And I'm praying that you will be filled to overflowing with the power of God's Spirit in your life. I am praying that you will be filled to the height and the depth and the width of God's incredible love that's able to do immeasurably more and beyond what you imagine or request. He knew where to connect them, to get them connected with God, to be filled to the, as Paul said, with the full measure of God. You were created for that. That you have access to that. We all have access to that. In these moments of discouragement, we do not have to turn to any kind of substance or source or anything else. We can turn to God, and He will fill us with His Spirit to overflowing. That's what He seeks to do in our life. Again, let me reiterate, that's natural. That's normal. To be filled with the Spirit of God. That's what you and I were created for. And just to ask God on a daily basis, keep me filled up with you, not just part and partial, but in overflowing. And clear out all this toxic stuff that's trying to creep into my life. There's so much toxic stuff out there today. So much toxic stuff that wants to rip us down and rip us apart and tear us down. So much false, so much untruth. We need the truth of God filling our souls and filling our hearts to keep us going. That's what Paul was able to speak of. In that same letter I mentioned earlier in Philippians 4:13, Paul talked about that. He said, I could do all things in Him who gives me strength. That's how I'm doing it. And so when he prayed for the Ephesians, he basically was saying, don't look at me. It's not in me. It's not some inner strength that I have. I have not been blessed with some special ability to overcome discouragement. It's by my looking to Him and trusting in Him. And that helps us overcome discouragement when we seek His face. In Hebrews 12, verse 2, another group of people who are facing difficult times. The writer to the Hebrews said to fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our salvation. He's the one who created and made our salvation, our relationship with God possible. And He's the perfecter of it. So we are reconciled with God. And that Spirit has access to our hearts and our lives if we just ask to be filled. You've heard the maritime expression, all hands on deck. Have you ever heard that expression? An old maritime expression, all hands on deck. In other words, when the circumstances are such, when the crisis has arisen, it does not matter what rank you are, you need to be on deck and man your station. That's what that means. When the circumstance arises, the situation arises, you, all hands are on deck, regardless of your rank. What Paul is advocating is the exact opposite of that. It's surrender all to Him. All of you on me. I'm taking my hands off this. I can't do this. I don't have it in myself. I take my hands off it. It's all of you, all over me. What's the best way to overcome discouragement? Not filled with this, not filled with any other short-lasting substance. The best way to overcome discouragement is to be filled with Him.